My name is Dr. Dwayne Quasey Wright. I'm an assistant professor of higher education administration, as well as the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the Graduate School for Education and Human Development here at the George Washington University in the nation's capital. And I have the honor to welcome you to our December DEI event. What do we mean by whiteness? Folks, to say that we are living in complicating and trying times in the world is a little bit of an understatement. We have seen within the past calendar year a vast amount of challenges. Many, if not all, have impacted education on really every level. Whether it be the condition that our teachers are trying to teach in, to the pressure that many educators feel to both explain the world around us, as well as keep their jobs. One aspect of this complication is the American history and discourse with the concept of whiteness. And to preempt our speaker a bit, when we mention whiteness, we are definitely not talking about white people. We are talking about a system and a function that impacts many things in America, including the education system. Therefore, in building on our ongoing mission to both educate and research, GSEHD has started this series called What Do We Mean By? And we attempt to have a very quick but very meaningful conversations on not necessarily controversial, but definitely impactful issues. And today's conversation is about the concept of whiteness and its impact and function within education. Today's presentation will be rather quick, and here's how it will work. After I introduce the speaker, I'll turn it over to them for about 25 minutes to a half an hour. At the end of that presentation, the audience will have the ability to react to what they learned, challenge if they need to in small groups, and then we'll come out and do a general Q&A and get you on with what I'm sure is a very busy day. A few caveats: we do not intend to have the definitive conversation on whiteness here today in 1 hour. If that was possible, we would all be on an island somewhere enjoying the fruits of our labor. And we should not probably find simple answers to complex issues. This is the start of an ongoing conversation, not the end of it. Also, as a private school, I always say this: GW reserves the right to remove anyone who is trying to disturb an event from a particular event. That's never happened, and I'm sure it won't happen today. But please know that we all come here with the ethos of inquiry rather than inquisition, to learn both from and with each other. And with those caveats done, I want to now turn it over to our featured speaker. Dr. Tyler Derreth is an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is also the associate director of the SOURCE, the Community Engagement and Social and Service Learning Center at Johns Hopkins University, where he conducts community-based projects in over 100 nonprofit organizations on various equity issues in Baltimore City. Dr. Derreth is too humble, but I will not leave this bio without saying he has a bachelor's degree from Dickinson College and a doctorate from a little old school called Penn State. In full disclosure, we were in school together. As an education researcher and a critical whiteness scholar, his research concentrates on the urban community, university partnerships, critical pedagogies, and equitable educational practices. He frequently writes, speaks, and teaches on issues of social justice, racism, and identity. His research, community, and curricular work has earned national recognition for his contributions to the field of critical studies and the promotion of racial justice. And GW loves to welcome Dr. Derreth. Tell us, what do you mean by whiteness? And Tyler, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. I'm going to take a second here to pull up a few slides to help us with our conversation today. Hopefully you all can see that. Even in just introductions, it's never easy to follow Dr. Wright. He's if not an eloquent speaker. So thank you for that wonderful introduction and for leading us even into the conversation today. It's very gracious. I'm going to do my best to keep the time so that we can have some discussion. As has been mentioned a few times, please drop into the chat various sort of questions and comments, and hopefully we can make this engaging and interactive as possible through the first few minutes here, and certainly in the second half of our conversation today. And with that, why don't we jump in? So what do we mean by whiteness? I thought maybe we could start with the briefest of history lessons. There's not going to be enough time to really dive into a true history lesson, but let's try and set some context here as we start. Why did whiteness get created? We can go back, and I'm going to go back to the 15th century in Portugal, where the European slave trade goes to Africa, and Africans are brought back for the purpose of enslavement, and therefore free labor and economic advancement. In Europe, this extends into the Western Hemisphere relatively quickly. And the reason that this happens and why it took off so well, let's say, in Europe in particular, for establishing brutal enslavement was folks couldn't escape. It was much harder to go anywhere if they're coming from a different continent. That advantage really set itself apart, and the slave trade to Africa, between Africa and Europe, was established very quickly. Now, part of establishing this brutality was trying to rationalize it, as people brought up their own concerns, is maybe an understatement, for this practice. The first way of doing this, of rationalizing it, was through religion, and saying, well, we're Christians and they're not, and that's okay then, because they're not Christians and therefore don't have the same rights. The problem then was that some folks were working on converting people who were enslaved, and then enslaved people were claiming, as well as anybody else, that they were indeed Christians. Now we have a problem. And this really became a problem, everywhere, but in the US, our very particular solution around this, especially legally, was to say, all right, maybe they're Christians, maybe they can convert, but there is a unavoidable, unaddressable difference based in race. And so race becomes the replacement for religion for identifying who gets to be human and who doesn't. And so now there's an, let's say, easily identifiable way of saying, if you are Black, you are less than human. If you are white, you are human. And that affords you different rights based on our legal system. Why go through the trouble of any of this? Well, it's always tied to, in some ways, the economy of our society, establishing and maintaining that economy to ensure that we have a perpetually enslaved underclass, affording not just free labor, but value in their bodies as goods, which launched the US in particular to the world stage in dramatic fashion. Part of the trouble as well, and why race and whiteness in particular is useful here, is that to maintain that kind of brutal oppression of so many people, because it wasn't just Black folks who were enslaved or what became eventually indentured servitude for white Americans and Europeans, was to establish a deep-seated division so that there could not be collaboration of this underclass of folks to overthrow oppressors who are, let's face it, are greatly outnumbered. The way of doing that was saying that for white folks, that they have some element of ownership tied to whiteness that Black people don't. And if you are working with them, you might lose that advantage. And then where would you be? Creating that division allows for the maintenance of this kind of system. So just a quick sort of context on that history. Again, happy to answer some questions, but we're going to try and move quickly through here. So to return to the question, what is whiteness and what is it doing? There are three things that I want to cover very quickly here. Whiteness, as its definition, the methods, approaches, discourses, and practices that maintain and advance systemic white supremacy. In some ways, we could say, okay, great, talk over. Let's talk about it now. And there's plenty to talk about. But I'm going to try and do a little bit more for us today here. And also define for us white supremacy. I am stealing wholesale from Charles Mills here. I think he does a great job in defining it for us. I've pulled a couple of quotes here that I think are pretty clear. The first being that white supremacy is a system of domination by which white people have ruled historically and presently. He goes a little bit further to explain that that system of domination is a political system, is a power structure of both formal and informal rule that has differential distribution of just about everything you can think of. Out of that, out of white supremacy and the activity that maintains it, that is whiteness, we have white privilege. Those are the unearned advantages and access to resources because of a person's appearance related to white skin. Some folks call this explicitly white skin privilege. Is doing the same thing there. So we've got three interrelated terms that are working to maintain a system of domination. Let's keep that in mind as we move through today. Just recently, a couple of researchers, Ozias and Pasque, wrote an article in a book, The Critical Praxis of Whiteness. They lay out 6 definitions of whiteness that you can look up the article. I think is relatively useful, even more than relatively. It's quite useful in trying to understand some of the inner workings of this. I'll run through this very quickly for you. They talk about whiteness as an ideology, so it's influencing our beliefs, discourse, that's our communications. Racial contract is a direct reference to Charles Mill's work, who argued that all of our systems are designed to be for white people specifically, and it's to the exclusion of all non-white people that these things are created. And so what we're talking about here are systems and structures of society. Whiteness as property is a reference to Cheryl Harris's work, who's a legal scholar, critical legal studies and critical race theory. Her argument is that our entire legal system is designed to protect property, private property, and that whiteness functions as private property in our system. And therefore, our legal system is designed to protect whiteness. Cheryl Matthias writes about feeling and affect quite well, and Ozias and Pasque rely on her and a few others to talk about this. You may have heard terms like white guilt or white rage or white tears. All of these are specific reactions, emotional reactions to needing to face your own personal or others' whiteness or racism in the moment. And so we talk about usually white people reacting in these immoral and undue ways that are trying to maintain their sense of self that's tied to the oppression of whiteness. Lastly, interactional and interlocking. This is just to identify that that white hegemony is one of many hegemonies and oppressions, and that it's not only intersecting, but as it's intersecting, is upholding the other oppressions, things based in gender and sex and religion and citizenship status and other things, right? We can add to the list. I'm 5 minutes in, and I've already given you these 6 definitions, as well as my own definition, and 3 other terms that are related to whiteness. And all of a sudden, we're starting to get very complicated and very academic, and it's hard to grab hold of these things. I want to pause for a second and just point out that this is actually a function of whiteness, is to make it very complicated to understand what it's doing, to cloud the clarity of this practice, to make it hard to identify so that when you're talking to folks and they say, how am I upholding whiteness? It's hard to really locate your answer to that question. And therefore, it's easy to maintain the avoidance of what we need to actually face here. And so what I'm going to do is just pose the question again. And for the rest of the time, I'm going to try and give you 2, what I hope are very clear answers that can ground any conversation that we're going to move forward in, depending on who we're talking with and what kind of conversation we're trying to have. So first, what do we mean by whiteness? We mean lies. Let's talk about what kind of lies. 100 years ago, Du Bois was writing and posed the same sort of question that we're posing today. What on earth is whiteness? That one should so desire it. And he says, always, somehow, some way, silently, but clearly, I'm given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. This is the lie of ownership, of rights, and of deservingness, that because of my white skin, because of the fact that I may be upholding whiteness and white supremacy, I deserve to have status. I deserve to claim anything as my own, and it is my right to be able to do so. This is calling up, hopefully, some of that stuff we talked about with whiteness as property, and instituting a legal system that protects the advantage and ownership and right of anything I lay claim to as a person who is upholding whiteness, or who is advantaged and privileged by it, like myself, as a person with white skin. 60 years ago, James Baldwin writes, "The American white has got to accept the fact that what he thinks he is not. He has to give up. He has to surrender his image of himself. And apparently this is the last thing white Americans are prepared to do. This is the lie of ignorance, of innocence, and of righteousness. The idea that I can somehow remove myself from white supremacy or from racism, that there is not a history that I am tied to of oppression, and that if I don't recognize it or acknowledge it, if I maintain my sense of self and the fact that I'm a good person and a right person, that I don't have to deal with the fact that I'm engaging in practices of whiteness. And if I don't ever face that lie, there's no way out of this." And that can trap us into some of that. James Baldwin talking about that 60 years ago. 25 years ago, Beverly Tatum writes, "The element that is whiteness of the person's identity is so taken for granted that it goes without comment. It is taken for granted by them because it's taken for granted by the dominant culture. This is the lie of normality, of historical centeredness, of racelessness. One way that we don't have to deal with whiteness and being white is to say that we don't claim any race, that everybody else has a race and we are the norm, the normative dominant culture, and therefore don't have to engage in it. We can see this in very simple things, right, of identifying folks by their race and citizenship when they're not white. African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, et cetera, we don't hardly ever say white Americans or even European Americans, as much as it's just, I'm American. That kind of language recentering is a simple example of much more insidious, impactful examples that are along those same lines. Other folks who have written about that, there's a book called Racism Without Racists, which gets at the same sort of thing, right? Is that this idea that's out there, but no individual person can lay claim or be tied to that practice or activity. What are these white lies doing? I pointed out a few of them. There are certainly others. The reason that I point out when these writers were writing is that in the past century of really, really incisive, illuminating writing that folks have been doing, among other kind of work that's doing some of the similar things of trying to dismantle whiteness, is that we're asking the same question and we're having the same conversations because these lies are really effective. And engaging in lying is a really effective way of maintaining and strengthening white supremacy's position of power. That's the point of these things. Now, how do they do that? They do that by erasing the existence of whiteness in order to avoid the reckoning of violence and inhumanity that it enacts. It suppresses and represses the reality of history and present-day power structures, tries to maintain a moral innocence for folks who are trying to uphold whiteness and white supremacy, even if they're not trying, right, but are. And it validates that status. It repositions white people as good people, right? There's always this effort when there's a reaction to saying that there is a lie that's happening here. And it almost always is grounded in this sense of needing to be a good person or be a part of a good society or a righteous or moral society that is designed on people getting what they deserve, essentially. All of this is about confirming the status quo by reducing internal discord that might actually spur change worth having. And if we can maintain enough of an internal homeostasis, avoid that kind of discord, then there's not ever going to be enough, especially for white folks, to abandon this kind of whiteness, to abandon these lies, and to need to rewrite not only a whole self, but a whole sense of what the world is and what it looks like. That's how effective some of these lies are at maintaining the world that we've made. Second, we mean terror. So by whiteness, we mean lies and we mean terror. Bell Hooks writes about some of her experience. She was writing about the picture of whiteness in the Black imagination, and inverts what many folks write about, especially in white literary canon, the Black image and white imagination. So she flips that idea upside down and she says, associations of whiteness with terror and the terrorizing remain, even though I live and move in spaces where I am surrounded by whiteness, surrounded. There is no comfort that makes the terrorism disappear. All Black people in the United States, irrespective of their class status or politics, live with the possibility that they will be terrorized by whiteness. Now, the one thing that I'll point out here is the white lies that I was talking about are particularly effective for those who gain advantage by white supremacy. I'm talking mostly about white people, but again, as Dr. Wright pointed out at the beginning, whiteness and white people are not the same. People can be advantaged by whiteness and take advantage of whiteness, even if they're not white. Now, what those white lies do, and speaking of Du Bois, he points out this sort of double consciousness idea that Black Americans see their reality very clearly and see white people's reality very clearly, where white people don't, right? They're buying into the white lies very explicitly. So we have a definition of whiteness particularly grounded in that reality, and we've got a definition of whiteness that is acknowledging the full spectrum of reality, of especially for folks who are terrorized by the violence of whiteness, and needing to point out this consistently, because what the white lies are doing is trying to hide this second definition. And so we need to always be clear that whiteness is tied to white supremacy, which is a system of domination. Remember, I said we're coming back to that. Which is really a system of inhumanity. Why this terrorizing by violence? Toni Morrison gives us some of the answer here. In 2016, she wrote, so scary are the consequences of a collapse of white privilege that many Americans have flocked to a political platform that supports and translates violence against the defenseless as strength. These people are not so much angry as terrified, with the kind of terror that makes knees tremble. Terrorized by white lies. So we're going to come back to this idea that the white lies are about maintenance. One of the ways that they do that is by instituting a fear of the other, by saying that there is something around the corner that's coming to take what you have gotten. And if you don't resist that at every turn, then your lives will crumble in front of you. And the only way to maintain that is through force, is through violence, is through strength. Morrison adroitly points out that strength and violence against defenseless is no strength at all. So a little bit more here on white terror. What are we meaning by white terror? I'll point out one more quote for you by David Roediger. It says, or he says, it's not merely that whiteness is oppressive and false, it is that whiteness is nothing but oppressive and false. I hope you see the parallel in this statement to what we've been talking about today, oppressive and false being different language for terror and lies. In this kind of white terror, first, it is a means of inflicting oppression in order to maintain a position of unearned and undeserved power. This happens through overt violence. It happens through disinvestment of Black communities. It happens through policies and laws of restriction and exclusion. This is grounded in a fear of the imagined other, and a fear that the other, that is non-white folks, would respond the same way that white people have, in violence and through retribution. I also will point out that there's a kernel of truth going on here, a sort of implicit recognition that all of the status gained by whiteness and through white supremacy is unearned. There's a recognition of this kind of weak foundation. If it were earned status, what would there be to be afraid of? That it might be taken. And so I'll point out that sort of illogic. There are many in the sort of logic of white supremacy, but that's one of them. The last thing I'll note before we move on to some implications for education is how whiteness works and reworks and reworks. What it's doing always at systems, systems and structural and institutional and interpersonal and intrapersonal and psychological and emotional levels, all at the same time, is setting parameters for what is appropriate activity within the dominant culture and communication and policy. Within these parameters, arguments for change are only about changing how whiteness is going to carry out its objective, that is, maintain the current system of white supremacy. So through this practice of what's appropriate and how we're going to be allowed to talk about change, we're going to say that whiteness is rewriting itself to adjust and update its methods of oppression. One of the easiest and clearest examples of this is the transition from slavery into Jim Crow eras. The ending of slavery did not end whiteness. What it did was it reset the parameters of what is appropriate so that whiteness could maintain itself. Slavery, no longer appropriate. We need new systems and new forms of engaging in how whiteness is going to function in order to maintain white supremacy. Enter Jim Crow. We have this happening all the time at structural and interpersonal levels. A decade ago, 15 years ago, it was, let's say, not appropriate in these kind of whiteness spaces to even say the words white supremacy. Now we have all sorts of what's called performative white allyship that's engaging in the language of talking about these things without actually enacting any work towards changing or undoing or dismantling any of this. The language activity barrier there is a new sort of adjustment of how whiteness is functioning to maintain a sense of being a good white person. Right now we're having a conversation between what is good and what is not good about how to maintain a sense of white self instead of trying to separate self from any white-based identity formation. The sort of paradox of having anything that it can be both good and white, right? That's an impossibility that we're trying to hold on to there. Some of the language of whiteness and the lies of whiteness is trying to maintain that sense of self. And so it's constantly transforming. We can even see this. There's some work that was done a few decades ago, a book called How the Irish Became White, right? As we even have growing parameters who is allowed to be white in order to maintain these divisions and senses of systems of oppression, which again makes it very hard to hold on to, very hard to maintain a grounded, concrete definition because it's constantly reacting and changing to our world that's resisting it. So again, trying to maintain clarity, going back to that only oppressive and false. Whiteness is lies and it's terror. In higher ed, how is this functioning? Historically and presently, institutions of higher education have been places of whiteness. This is where history gets rewritten to center white people and white society, European society and American society. It controls the literary canon as being a white canon. It elevates scientific discovery as white scientific discovery. It has always limited access. It has always diverted resources away from non-white communities. There are unwritten rules of whiteness that are part of the culture of these places. If you think about even initially how these institutions were started, especially in the South, these were essentially American finishing schools for rich white men coming from their family plantations in many instances to learn how to be white gentlemen. None of that was undone as much as moved past, right? But without undoing these things, it is still baked into and grounded in the history of these places. Privileges of looking the part, again, white skin privilege in all of these places, if nothing has been undone, it's written into it. And then finally, I'll speak to some of the administrative structure of these places. Universities are not designed for change. They're designed to maintain and establish themselves over centuries of time. There's no accident that many of the oldest institutions of our country and really in the world are universities. We have an organizational theory name for this called institutional inertia, and it's the idea that maintenance of self is a primary objective of these organizations. You can see a lot of parallels with this in white supremacy. And in fact, these institutions often work together with the prevailing system of domination in order to maintain themselves. And so there's not much of an interest in engaging in change that goes against the institutional structure and organization of these places. So when we are working, we need to be aware that what we're doing is resisting the very structure of these places, and not just institutions, but almost any educational institution, but almost any institution that's had success in this kind of system of domination. How do we go about doing that? I hope that this is some of where our conversation goes today, but I'll try and get us started with some of this. First, break from the parameters of what is appropriate that's set by whiteness, which means it will almost always feel dangerous to talk about some of the things we have to talk about. It will feel at least uncomfortable. And I'll point out that depending on who we are and our proximity to whiteness, we have different advantages and safeties and privileges when we go about talking about these things. So we need to always sort of hold on to our intersectional identities and our positionalities as we're thinking about these things. And I'll leave that to you to consider for yourselves. But all of us, no matter who we are, can be thinking about how we break these parameters. That means that we need to acknowledge that any change that's going to dismantle white supremacy, any change that's going to abandon whiteness, is going to be bigger and deeper and costlier than anyone committed to whiteness is going to admit. But also is more necessary and more freeing and more life-affirming than anyone committed to whiteness will ever admit. It is essential work if we are going to try and affirm anyone, including ours, that is our white peoples who are privileging from this, humanity. Everyone is caught up in the prison of whiteness here in very different ways, and for some of us in more comfortable ways that help us contribute to the maintenance of it. We're all caught in it. Think of the inhumanity of being a person who carries out the violence, for example, as well as being labeled inhuman through that violence. Lastly, speak clearly about whiteness is and what it does in order to break from it in our actions and policies and discourses. We can think of those 6 things that I showed you earlier from Ozias and Pasquet. What I mean here is not to get caught up in the complications and the masking and the pervasiveness of whiteness that tries to paralyze us and tries to avoid conversation and make conversation complicated and in some folks' eyes unrealistic. Grab hold of the clarity of what whiteness is doing always. It is lying to us and it is terrorizing us. With that, we need to react entirely differently to that. Hold on to truth, hold on to love as opposites of lies and terror to engage and guide the actions and policies and discourses we're going to work through. Because very fundamentally, and as simply as I can put it, abandoning whiteness is a commitment to humanity, ours and others. That, I think, is what can get us started with some definitions of whiteness. That is what we mean, at least to start. I'll leave you with this as we transition, I think, into some breakout rooms for the second half of our conversation. And I'll let you read that, a final word from Toni Morrison. And I look forward to conversations. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Derreth, for that wonderful presentation and for leaving us with some really thought-provoking ideas, truths, and challenges.